Good morning and welcome to this Corney & Lind webinar. My name's Joe Swin. I'm with the business development team here at Corney & Lind. And before we get started, I'm going to go through a quick few bits of housekeeping before the presentation starts. Today's presentation is entitled Legal Aspects of Managing a PR Crisis, and it's going to be presented by Matthew Shearing, who's a senior lawyer here at Corney & Lind. Now, you can't see any slides in front of you at the moment. We've got some technical people working on that at the moment, so that should come very soon. But I will just run through some bits, and then we'll hand over to the main presentation. The slides will start appearing as they come, so just bear with us a short while. But yeah, so a copy of today's recording is going to be made. So if you check back on our website partway through next week, you'll be able to see that. So if you have to run away for any reason today, or if you know somebody who might find this useful, the recording will be made available partway through next week. So if you check back on our website under our resource center, and you can see our previous recordings there. So lots to look forward to there. There is a chat box in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to enter those there. Now, do be aware everybody can see the questions that you type there. So worth noting, just be careful if you're entering any sort of personal information. I'd recommend avoiding that. But yeah, today's presentation is being run by Matthew Shearing, who's a senior lawyer here, passionate about standing in the gap for his clients. He's great at cutting across lots of the legal jargon and getting straight to the matters to make sure that you actually know exactly what's going on. And he's done a variety of work across litigation, defamation, and disputes and commercial litigation, and even debt recovery. So lots of expertise is going to come in useful today. And I'm going to hand over to Matt now.
Great, thanks, Joe. So good morning, everyone. I will be just presenting as we go. Like Joe said, if you've got any questions along the way, just put them in the chat box. If we see them, I might answer some while we go along. Otherwise, we'll have a more robust Q&A session at the end of the presentation anyway. So a little bit of introduction about us. Most of you are probably familiar with Corney & Lind, but we're a boutique mid-sized law firm with 18 lawyers and over 13 staff. Our focus areas include education, not-for-profit, commercial. We do employment, personal injury, and several other areas, including family law and criminal and traffic. But our lawyers do travel to you if needed, and we're committed to providing just redemptive outcomes in all of our matters. So what we're going to cover today, so this issue of managing a PR crisis is quite complex because, as you're probably no doubt aware, being involved in the school sphere, there's a lot of different ways these crises can come at you. And the fact that we do so much online now has only complicated things more and increased our attack surface in that regard. So we'll be going through a bit about defamation, first of all, what it is and what you need to look out for from both sides. So from the side of being defamed, but also just some best practices to make sure that your employees or the school isn't defaming someone else as well. We'll look at the importance of the enrolment contract in heading off a lot of these PR crises before they begin. And we'll also look at some strategies for managing high conflict individuals and essentially avoiding a PR crisis to begin with. And then also we'll move past that to when the management really hasn't succeeded and we're now having to deal with an actual PR crisis. Finally, we'll go into social media policies and some real strategies for dealing with your online presence as a school, and talk about litigation only when it's absolutely necessary. So to begin with, I just wanted to run through a case study of a case that we were involved in a few years ago, and it was quite complex and it was quite a large case. It involved a P-12 private school, and the case centered around the father of a young child at the college. Now, this father had been divorced from the mother during the time the child was at the school, and relationships between the father and the school gradually became more and more acrimonious, and it corresponded with what was probably some issues outside of the school sphere for this individual. There are a lot of changes going on in his life, and in many ways it looked like he was looking for someone to lash out at, and that the school was a likely target because that's where his kids were. So the litigation initially involved a 1.7 million claim to the Federal Circuit Court for misleading and deceptive conduct on the part of the school, and that was all just in relation to an admin charge that had been given for duplicate reports, and there was also a damages claim against the college and the board itself for $3.5 million. So in all, it was about over a $5 million claim to the court. And there were various other claims and appeals involved in that, and they were all eventually fought off and dismissed at significant cost to the college, of course. The college then commenced proceedings in the Supreme Court in the middle of 2013 to restrain the father from publishing any more material, because a lot of these allegations were being aired in a very public blog format on the father's website, and the injunction was granted in June 2013 by the Supreme Court, and he was told not to publish any more content. And not only that, but the father did give an undertaking to the Supreme Court as well that he wouldn't institute any more proceedings, because by this stage there'd been several different proceedings brought before the court, and the college had to pay the money to defend all of those proceedings as well. Later that year, there was a deed of settlement between the father, his wife, and the college, essentially trying to bring everything to an end. Everyone had been involved in a lot of litigation, and the real goal of it was to try and make it almost impossible for this father to bring any more litigation. But unfortunately, there were even more publications after that, and the Supreme Court had to get involved again. And the college eventually prosecuted applied to the court to have the father dealt with, and he was given 12 months imprisonment, which was wholly suspended, but it would be actual jail time if he breached anything more. And that was essentially where the whole saga ended. So the takeaway from that, from our perspective, was that sometimes it's almost impossible if these individuals are committed enough to making life difficult for a school. It's almost impossible to head these things off. But we began to focus on how do we try and deal with these issues before they come up. And so that's why we run webinars on this topic almost every year, and we try and give some really practical advice about how you can try and head these things off before they get that bad. So the first real issue in all of this, and it's one of the biggest topics these days, is defamation. Now, defamation under the law is regarded as an imputation or assertion which would cause ordinary, reasonable members of society to think less of someone. So it essentially means if you took someone on the street and you said, hey, what do you think about this statement? And they said, oh, well, yeah, I'd think less of that person if I heard that. That's essentially defamation. There's a couple of qualifications to that, though, and the first qualification is that to defame someone, that statement must be published somewhere. So it must be put out in public, in the public sphere, or in at least a group of people where there's visibility on that, and it must also be untrue. So you're not able to claim defamation if the thing is true, and a lot of people run up against this thing because they see something published about them and they say, oh, well, that's defamation. But if it's got its basis in truth, then all that's being done there is just reporting on a fact. So there's not much recourse if that happens. The big issue that we run into now is before the digital age, you had to physically print something and disseminate it as a document to be able to defame someone. So you would have to either type it out on a typewriter or write it in a newspaper and have it published there and pay for the ad or the article before you could get it to people. But now it can be done with a click of a button. You can log into Twitter or you can log into Facebook, type the sentence out, hit enter, and the defamation can happen in 5 seconds. So the thing about defamation law too is that the court and the government doesn't see any distinction between what you publish on, say, Facebook or Twitter and what you publish in a newspaper. It's one and the same thing.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here. The slides have been dropped into the chat. You can download those to your computer, and the slide that we're currently on is number 2, defamation. So if you have PowerPoint on your computer, you can feel free to follow along with the slides there. And Matt will sort of mention when we're moving to the next slide. So Yeah, I'll hand back over to Matt. Thank you.
Cool. So you can also be held responsible for the defamation, the dissemination of information from others. So if you, as a school, put out a weekly article or a weekly magazine, and someone publishes in that, and you haven't had much approval of that, but it's a guest column, the school could be held liable for that, and that's been quite established for a long time. But if it happens on your Facebook page, for example, if someone comments on your Facebook page and a lot of other people are seeing that, or someone retweets something that someone else has said, which is essentially taking that post and sharing it to their audience, if that's the school account doing that or someone from the school, it can potentially have consequences as well. So there's a risk that if someone defames a school, like the school in the case study, and others believe it, then that's a risk of defamation. But there's also the risk that you as a school defame someone else. And so we're just turning to the next slide. So it's the second defamation slide. So in cases where a school is being defamed online, the best thing you can do is exercise caution. And the big thing you need to do is sit back and ask yourself, okay, what practical input does this what practical impact does this have? And so you want to be looking at a number of factors to work out how this is going to affect the school, if at all. So the first thing you want to look at is how visible is this post. So if it's coming from someone with, say, 10 followers and it's just gone to their audience, it's not likely you're going to have to worry about that. And sometimes it can actually, if you take issue with it and you draw attention to that, it can actually have the opposite effect, where you something that would have been very, very minor and lost within the thousands and hundreds of thousands of social media posts a day suddenly gets a spotlight shined on it because you've paid attention to it. The second thing you need to ask is it true? If it's founded in truth, if it's just someone reporting on a fact like a journalist or a disgruntled parent, but the basis of it's true, there's really not much you can do because we don't have restrictions in this nation about reporting on the truth. It's just when you're reporting on things that aren't necessarily true that the law may come to your aid. The next thing to ask is, even if it is being shared to a number of people, is it being taken seriously? There's people with significant followings that are more followed for the comedy value rather than the actual formative value to people watching it. So you need to be asking, okay, how are people actually taking this? And the question to ask yourself at the end, if you get through all those and still say, yeah, this is concerning, you want to ask, what are the consequences for me leaving it be? And what are the consequences for me taking action? And just try and work out, that's essentially how you want to work out your response. Like I said, the moment you draw attention to something, it's likely that it's going to get more attention, and that's generally how things go viral. And you'll see examples of that all through social media and internet culture now, where someone who's relatively unknown will get attention from someone who's very well known, and all of a sudden they'll have a lot more attention and become quite well known themselves. So that's something you need to consider. But if it is a serious problem, if it's a serious problem, you need to assess the options. And I'll cover more on that when we get further into the presentation, when we talk about practical management of a PR crisis. So I'm swapping to the next page, which is the last defamation page, number 2, defamation. And this is from the other side of the coin, where it's talking about what happens if a school representative has published something that's defamatory. And you really need to be asking the same questions for this. So you need to firstly ask, okay, what's the benefit of us leaving this public? And almost always I say that the benefit of leaving something public is less than taking it down. If there's going to be any question of an issue with it, generally you want to err on the side of caution. The next thing you need to ask is, would this statement that we've made cause anyone to think less of anyone else? And if that's the case, I definitely recommend taking it down. And then essentially just ask, is it useful? Can you request that it be taken down if it's a staff member or a student or even a parent? And what if the last question to ask is, what if it goes viral? What if a lot of people start sharing this? What are going to be the consequences of that? Because things might be okay in your small audience of parents, but I've seen instances a lot where something is completely fine within one semi-cordoned off group of people, but the moment it gets outside and someone else pays attention to it, there's a very different impression of what's being said. So you always want to be erring on the side of caution. You want the principal down, so principal, staff, volunteers, you want to be very careful about what they're posting on social media when it's in relation to the school. And if there are certain publications that mention the school or tag the school social media account, even if they're not owned by you, they could be seen as representing the school's views as well. So it's more than just looking in your own backyard. It's looking at how people are engaging with you. And sometimes it may be wise to contact them and say, hey, love that you're engaging with us and doing things with us on social media, but would you mind taking this down? Because it's not really in keeping with with the message that we want to put out there in public. And look, the best way to manage all this is a robust social media policy, and we'll go into some tips for that later on as well. So I'm turning now to the next section, which is high conflict personalities. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's really worth noting that and understanding why we have these certain individuals that cause a lot of problem. And for anyone that's been in the education industry for any length of time, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There's a publication by Bill Eddy called High Conflict People in Legal Disputes. And Bill Eddy is from a psychological background, and he also has some legal experience. And he calls these individuals querulent personalities. And he says that these personalities, these high conflict personalities, make up less than 1% of the population, but they actually account for approximately 30% of the complaints. So they're quite overrepresented in how much time and money they cost people. And they are generally the personalities that can pursue complaints for longer and produce far more material in support of their cases. So in my day-to-day job, advising a lot of clients, I do several different areas of law, and generally what it comes down to, some people will come to me and say, I want to fight this because of the principle, and I say, well, okay, that's great, but the principle will only last you for the first couple of months until you start getting the bills, and you start having to appear in court appearances, and you start having to draft a whole trench of material. And a lot of the time, that's why these matters settle commercially. People just get worn out with the litigative process, and they decide to settle matters. But these high conflict individuals, they don't work that way, and they will pursue things for a lot longer. So it's best to, as much as you can, try and head these things off early. Some things that characterize high conflict personalities: they're persistent, they're demanding, they're rude, they're frequently threatening. They suffer in their own life in pursuit of their claim, so generally it actually affects them more than it affects you in a lot of ways. And they show an increasing need for vindication and revenge. And generally the key thing with them is that there's generally originally a genuine grievance. So there's been something that's actually gone wrong at the start, and they've gotten very annoyed about that. And as their feelings haven't been validated, as they've ruminated on these things, that's when things get a little bit off kilter and they go down the rabbit hole. So I'm just moving to the next page. And look, I've said earlier that identifying them early is really the key, and I think this is where your enrolment process comes into the mix. If you can identify these people early and take preventative measures to either not even have them at your school, or if they are at your school, to make sure that you're managing them very well, you will probably avoid a lot of these more litigative issues because you've dealt with them appropriately. So your enrolment contracts are your first line of defence, and I always say prevention is better than a cure. So it's not unrealistic in your enrolment contracts to ask for references and recommendations from previous schools or community figures. And the way I normally justify this is by saying, look, if you are going to rent a house, or if you are going to get a new job at a company, the first thing they do is they say, okay, you can tell us whatever you want, but we want to know what other people are saying about you. So they will ask for your references. They'll ask for how much money you're making in your current job. They'll generally ask for professional and personal references as well to see how you operate in both those capacities. And and that's generally because you're building a long-term relationship there. As a renter or as an employee, you're going to be there for a significant amount of time, and that's even more the case with schooling. Some of these children come in at preschool or prep, and they're going to be there till grade 12. And that's a long time. So you're getting into a very long-term relationship with them, and so I don't think it's unreasonable for you to be wanting to know a lot about them before they come in, and that's what you want to be building into your enrolment contracts. That allows you to identify the red flags earlier. So I'm now turning over to the next slide, which is the enrolment contract. It should play a central role in establishing the ground rules for parents, and I think the enrolment contract is probably the best way to manage expectations for your parents and other children coming in. The best thing to have with it is for it to be in writing, signed by both parents in case something goes wrong in the future, and it should really incorporate the enrolment application. So you want to require full disclosure in this application. You want both parents to certify they're being honest, because if down the line it turns out they're not being honest with something, you want to have recourse to end that relationship. And if you said in that contract, you are certifying that you're being honest with us, you're disclosing everything, and that doesn't occur, then you've got recourse down the track. And that also allows you at the outset to discern if some families might be problems when you do their referee checks. I think another thing you need to be concentrating on in your enrolment contracts is looking at the consequences of split families. So you really want to be putting obligations on parents to notify the changes have occurred, and you also want to be putting obligations on parents to notify that court orders are in place. So if there's domestic violence orders, or if there's family orders which talk about the time that both parents are spending with the children. And you want to put an obligation on both parents to pay the fees as well. And this is all essentially managing things that can go wrong in the future, because the reality is a lot of these issues which end up being PR crises do arise from family issues. They arise from when things are going wrong on the home front, and when parents split up. That can be the catalyst for someone taking issue with something and wanting to lash out somewhere. So that's another way that you can proactively manage your enrollments and the people who are enrolled. The other thing to say is you want to be requiring appropriate behaviour by the students and their parents. So you want to require them to comply with relevant policies. I'm on the next page again, sorry. So if you cross over to the next enrolment contract slide, you also want to require mutual trust and cooperation between the parents and the college, and I think that's really important. So you want to set out the terms of the relationship before they begin the relationship. These enrolment contracts, I think, should be relatively regularly reviewed, and they can be tailored to your specific circumstances. So if you have a parent, who is behaving badly and who is causing issues, it's best to have a clause in your enrolment contract which says we can impose extra terms at our discretion in the event of an incident with a parent, or in the event that the relationship breaks down. So that would, generally the things that you might impose once things start going wrong is how the parents have contact with the school, the college, what events they're allowed to attend, and what that attendance is meant to look like. And if things are really bad, you can just impose an immediate non-compliance termination on those parents. But obviously that decision needs to be very considered, because you've got kids at the school, and you've generally also got another parent involved who may not be a guilty party at all in all of this. So I'm just moving on to the next slide now, which is managing the impact of high conflict personalities. And this is just some really practical tips to try and head off these PR crises at the start. If you can engage with these high conflict people, who are the ones that generally cause these PR crises right at the beginning, and you can make them feel validated and make them feel like they've been listened to, a lot of the time that's it. That's all you need to do. Once they've got that feeling, they won't feel the need to push things on. So the first thing you want to do is make sure to listen to their concerns. And when I'm talking about that, I'm saying that you want to make sure you're actually listening carefully and using reflective listening. I think it's generally good to, at least at first instance, get face to face, look them in the eye, and ask them, what's going wrong. Ask them about their feelings, and the reflective listening technique is essentially, you engage with what they're saying. They say, I feel like I'm not being communicated with, and these are the reasons why. And then you say, okay, so what I'm hearing is that you think there's a breakdown in communication here, and we could improve in that area. That means you've engaged with what they've said. You've kind of summarised it, and you've now moved on. You've given them another opportunity then to further clarify on that. One of the biggest keys with reflective listening, though, is you want to show that you understand without agreeing with what they say, because high conflict personalities are very good at trying to get you on their team. And once they feel they've got you on their team, if you do something that doesn't mesh with their impression of you being on their team, they'll feel very, very betrayed, and it can actually end up being worse than it would have been if you hadn't have even engaged with them at the start. So you don't want to focus on the emotion. You don't want to reinforce that you believe in them, but you want to manage their concerns. So you want to communicate that you're investigating things. You want to be clear where you can and can't assist, and you want to be respectful. Give credit where credit's due. Credit is one of the biggest ways that you can diffuse situations as well, by giving people compliments. And I always say, try and give them something to do. If there is an issue, if there is a breakdown, give them some homework. It's not unreasonable to say, okay, this is what we're going to go away and do, but this is what we want you to go away and do as well. And that means they'll take ownership for that and take some responsibility for it. So that's some strategies. But look, I'm moving to the next slide now, and the big thing with that is that's at the very beginning. But if things do start to turn contentious, you want to cover your backside as much as you can. So if you get the feeling that matters aren't being resolved and they're progressing to the next stage, you want to start getting everything in writing. Don't communicate verbally wherever possible if it's looking like things are going to get worse. Take any notes. If you are communicating verbally, take detailed notes of that conversation. And generally you want to have at least 2 staff members present if you're having a meeting where you believe there might be a high conflict situation, because that will give you some witnesses. If you receive correspondence, and you will receive correspondence if things get out of hand, and it will probably be very lengthy and using lots of capital letters and exclamation marks, you want to use Bill Eddy's BIFF method in responding. So respond by being brief, be informative, be friendly, but be firm. And that's essentially the worst thing you can do is engage with everything they're saying and all that emotions. It's a lot better to cut across that. Be very polite, but be very firm in the school's position, and just make sure that you're getting everything in writing in relation to that conflict. The other thing you need to do too is you want to be very clear about what they've agreed to previously, and this is where your enrolment contract comes in. So the enrolment contract we talked about before, you can begin referencing, and you can say, as you agreed in the enrolment contract at this session, this is what we do, or as you know, from our policies which are referenced in our enrolment contract, this is the way we do things here, and this is why we're doing what we do, and here's your signature on the enrolment contract. And point those places out, because that shows that you're not just acting on your own whims, but you're actually acting consistently with what they agreed to in the first place. Okay, I'm just going to move to the next slide now, which is practical PR management. So the first question that when it comes to, let's say that none of that worked, and you're now in a situation where the conflict has really progressed, and there might be court proceedings that are being threatened, or they may have even started something, or there may be news teams getting involved, or any number of things that has just shown that the conflict has escalated. The first question you need to ask when something goes wrong, or on the other hand, when something is posted online, like we talked about before, you need to ask yourself, who is seeing this? So in the instance we talked about earlier with the blog posts, initially not that many people were seeing those blog posts that father put up, but then the father started going to the media, and the father started posting on social media as well, and more and more people were seeing the posts, and there were TV crews. There were, I'm almost certain there was a section on Today Tonight at one stage. And I know that it's quite a low bar to get on that show, but the reality is a lot of people watch it, and news teams love a story. And so initially, not that many people were seeing it, but as time went on, more people were seeing it. And so you need to ask yourself when these things start getting out of hand, who is seeing this? What are they saying? Is it true? Are their allegations true? Again, there's not as much you can do when the allegations are true. But the other thing you need to ask too is if you leave it alone, how damaging will it be? And like I said earlier, if you're engaging with something and they don't have a big audience, the very fact that you're engaging with it's often worse because you're giving them more attention. If you decide, if you weigh all those options up, and they're all there in the PowerPoint slide, so you can work through it yourself if you ever get in this situation. And if you do decide that you need to engage with the individual or the content that's gone online, you want to be considering what the best avenue is. So is it okay to engage with it yourself, or should you be engaging with it through a legal representative or someone else that can be a bit of a stopgap between you and the individual? You really want to be considering your responses carefully. So you want to be running them past someone else. I always recommend at least having 2 people involved in any response to these high conflict individuals, because you will generally find that you'll miss things and they'll pick up on some things, and maybe if you're very close to this, they'll blunt some of your sharp edges before you respond. And just remember the rules about defamation too. There's nothing worse than if you're responding to something and you start making allegations, or you start saying things that aren't necessarily true, or you don't know for a fact. You don't want to be caught up in a defamation proceeding because someone defamed you and then you defamed them, because then it becomes a bit of tit for tat, and it's always easier to take the high road in these situations. And the biggest thing is too, you don't want to respond with hostility, and I always recommend that you take some time before responding. I generally take a whole night. So if I receive correspondence here in the firm, and it's an angry letter from another lawyer or someone who's unrepresented, and I might get quite riled up about that myself when I read it, but I've learned that the best thing you can do is take some time, go for a walk, or leave it overnight, and then come back and formulate how you're going to respond, because emotions are almost never helpful when you're formulating these responses and these strategies. So it's a lot better to separate yourself from that and come back with a clear head. If you're responding to directly in minor matters, the one thing I would say is just be really conscious of the fact that people will probably see that response as well, especially if it's on social media. So I always use the example of responding to bad reviews. Some people do this really well, and some people do this really poorly. You will see some organisations on Google or Amazon or wherever they're based who get a bad review. So they get a 1-star or a 2-star. And someone may make some horrible claims about what actually went on that may not be true. The good organisations I see, they engage with those responses and they say, thank you for taking the time to write down a review for us. We understand this is how you feel. And a lot of the time they'll say, look, we've checked our records and that doesn't line up with what we have here, but we'd love to discuss further. You can contact our manager on this address. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do, and we'd love to do better next time. That's something simple like that, and that's obviously just making it up off the cuff. Looks really good on a review site, and it shows that you've respected the person, you've engaged with their feedback, even if it wasn't correct. And anyone else looking at the rating will look at that response and go, well, these guys sound all right. I don't know how true this rating might actually be. Then it may be someone that was disgruntled and got the wrong view. But you'll see equally as much, you'll see bad responses where a bad review will go up and the organisation will respond, and they'll start pointing fingers and they'll start airing all the dirty laundry and potentially breaching privacy as well, which is what you really want to avoid, especially in a school setting, because there are a lot of confidentiality obligations on you. So as much as possible, you want to make sure your outward face, your public presence, is as polite as respectful, but also as firm as it possibly can be. Sometimes offering to meet face-to-face, like I've said before, can be all that is needed to diffuse a situation. Remember your privacy obligations. So if you haven't reviewed it recently, the Australian privacy principles are part of the Australian Privacy Act, and they make it a bit easier to read. And if you're a school with, I think, over $2 million of revenue, they do apply to you, but they're also a good guideline for anyone else that they don't apply to. So I'd recommend reading through those and also just familiarising yourself with the Privacy Act. It's a topic in and of itself, but there's a lot of good media out there, and you just want to make sure that in any of your responses you're not breaching any of your privacy obligations, especially when it relates to children. If parents are posting things up about children, I'd tread very carefully in how you respond to those things. And look, in those instances, it probably would be best to get some legal advice around that situation, just to make sure that you don't make matters worse rather than better. And that does segue into the more serious issues. So if it is looking like a more serious situation, and often I get asked, how do you know that it's a more serious situation? Generally, if it's in the public domain, with the potential for a lot of publicity, and the potential that if it remained there, it could be very detrimental to the school, whether it's a school image, whether it's a school staff, or even if it's the students, that's when you probably need to start considering seeking legal advice, because you've moved away from just a simple conflict and you've moved into a realm where things can be very damaging and everything's happening in a very public setting. Defamation can be managed, and I always say, these things can be managed, but they need to be managed from at arm's length, and they need to be managed with consideration. And it's almost never the right answer to rush into these things, even though that's your natural instinct. Because if something's online, you feel like I just need to get this down straight away. But you generally need a good plan. And so look, the general process, and I just wanted to use an example that we've had previously here in the office. We had a client who had some there was an article published about something that his company had been doing, and there was some truth to the matter, but there was also a lot of falsehood or like half-truths to the matter, and it was published by an organisation who probably should have known better. But what happened was that this organisation published the article, and several other news organisations picked the article up, and while they didn't publish anything in and of themselves, so they didn't expand on the article, they were essentially just saying, this organisation says this about this other organisation. So they were kind of reporting on the news of the news. But what happened with that was, whenever anyone would search on Google for our client, those articles would come up, and because his business was quite small and these companies were quite big, and so they would rank a lot higher in the search engine rankings than his little organisation would for his terms. And unfortunately, his business was named in these articles. So he came to us and he said, look, a little bit of this is true, but most of it's falsehood, and I want it taken down. And that was a case where it was defamation. So the process was, he came to us, he said, this is what's gone on. We said, okay, we need to write what's called a takedown notice, and we wrote that to the other side, and there was some back and forth, but eventually through several legal letters and through some threats of taking things further, we had the article taken down that originated, that was referred to by all the news outlets. They issued a formal response on all their a formal apology, on all of their social media platforms. And the article, and then he was able to contact the news agencies and say, hey, this was actually inaccurate. I'd love for you to take these down, because otherwise my lawyers will be in touch with you as well. And the news articles one by one were also taken down. So it was a really positive outcome from him. You can now Google his business, and those articles don't show up. But it had to be managed, and when it was managed correctly, the organisation was at the end quite apologetic, and they admitted that they weren't operating on a lot of information, which is quite common in journalism these days. So but without the practical management there, it would have been very difficult. It would have been very easy for him to respond in anger and begin, ranting on social media and then defaming them as well. So they're quite sensitive topics. So I'm just moving over now to the heading on slide. The next slide. The heading is number 7, social media policy. So I hope you're all still able to follow along. The one last thing in this PR management suite is your social media policy, and maybe 5 to 10 years ago it wasn't as important. I think it's almost the most important policy that you will develop as an organisation now, because so much of how we relate to each other is based on social media, and it's almost become your digital storefront in a lot of ways, and you can build or lose a reputation very easily on social media. So a robust social media policy allows you to control your media presence, and most importantly, allows you to reduce the risk. So a good social media policy should explain why a policy is important, first of all, right at the top, so everyone reading it knows that this is the reason why you take it so seriously. It should detail the expectations. It should detail the consequences of a breach. So if someone breaches it, what can they expect to happen? And also have some requirements in there about when the relationship with the schools come to an end. So just like in your enrolment contracts, you can reference your social media policy, and that can actually still bind parents after they're finished at your school if you draft it correctly. And it can also obviously bind all your employees and your volunteers. And that being said, a school does have several different moving parts. So that you do have employees, you've got your principals, you've got your students, you've got your volunteers, and you've got your parents. And the thing about most of these is that the awareness and the education is really the best form of prevention. A lot of people don't realise the impact that their social media presence can have. Usually everyone involved in the school wants to do the right thing, but they don't really know the risks. And the example I always use is I used to do a lot of work with Red Frogs. So Red Frogs is a chaplaincy support network which operates during Schoolies Week, so both Schoolies Week around Australia and also through the universities throughout the year in the residential colleges. And we, during Schoolies Week, actually we'd enforce a social media blackout for all our volunteers on certain topics. And it was really hard for us because we were a young organisation, and we had mainly young people, and telling everyone to not post about something they're quite passionate about was hard. But we really wanted to make sure that we were managing the brand very well. And as you know, at Schoolies, it's a time where many news networks descend upon the area, and they're wanting to report on anything they can find to chip away at, to tarnish reputation of. They want to report on it because that's what they do, and I think people like news which says that young people are doing the wrong thing, which generally isn't what happens down there anymore. But we let our volunteers know about it, so we spent some time developing the policy, and then in the training we explained to them all. We said, look, this isn't about us wanting to restrict you from using social media. It's about protecting the brand, and it's about making sure that the message that needs to be out there on social media is actually out there. And we also want to protect you too. We don't want you to get in trouble. We don't want you to be accosted by news reporters for something you've written. So it's about protecting your staff as well. And once they were aware of that, everyone was more than willing to comply with the policy because they understood it. So that's generally what you want to do when you start implementing this stuff, is make sure you're explaining it to your staff. I've just moved to the next slide, which talks about the general social media policy. So the factors you want to consider for any social media policy is what appropriate posts people could be making on social media, and what posts aren't appropriate on social media. So you want to always be asking, if as a school you're putting things out, have I got permission from a person before I post about them? That's very basic. Because you're an organisation, you don't want to be posting about everyone without their permission. Another thing to ask is, should you be weighing in on controversial issues online? I almost always say no. I know some people feel quite passionately about certain defining issues in our society, but the school social media page is not the place to be doing it. And that goes hand in hand with asking yourself, does this need to be shared publicly? Do we actually need to put this out? And the one thing that's becoming more and more of an issue is asking yourself, will this post be discriminatory? We've got a lot of hot button topics at the moment. I call them risk topics. That could be LGBT, that could be gay marriage, it could be abortion. Anything that's politically charged, a school shouldn't be posting about. And like I said, I know some people are passionate about that stuff, but the risk factor for the school sticking its neck out is just not worth whatever small reward or validation that someone may feel by posting about that. So that's something that you really want to maybe kick around the office before someone, if someone's posting on a school social media page and they've even got an inkling that it might not be something that everyone's going to be happy with, the best thing you can do is tell everyone else and ask them what they think. And the other thing to look at too is who has the ability to post on your school pages. I'd be limiting that. I think it's very good practice to have a social media manager who can manage a lot of your social media presence. For principals, so I'm moving to the next slide now, and we'll go through these really quick. For principals, the big thing you need to be aware of is that most people see your posts as the views of the school. You're the face of the school. You're the head of the school. Anything you post, even if it's in a personal capacity, most people will associate with the school, and that may include anything you repost or retweet. So, the one example that's probably worth noting now is if you're on LinkedIn, and most of us are on LinkedIn now, and you like a post, that like will show up to everyone. That post will show up to everyone and show that you liked it now. So even something as innocuous as a like, if it's not something that meshes with the views of the school, it might just be worth not clicking that like button, just for the risk. And look, personal views, the same thing. If it's a personal account but you're a principal of the school, look, it's just probably not worth expressing those personal views unless you've run it past the rest of the school first. And just consider who's seeing your posts too. Your followers aren't necessarily your parents or your staff. There's a lot of other people, a lot of journalists and media who follow school principals, and they're just waiting for a story. So my advice is don't give them one. And also just consider how you're interacting with parents and media on social media as well. That all applies, I'm moving to the next slide now, that applies generally to employees as well. And I think it's very important in your social media policy to define where the boundaries are and what types of posts are appropriate for employees using school-related accounts. And you probably want to avoid things like political posts about issues in society which are controversial, and even posts about people. If it's relating to the school in a school capacity and you've got teachers posting about kids, make sure you've got the permission of those parents before you post about those kids and they're happy with their kids' images being shared. I know personally that my view is that I don't want my children being featured on social media almost at all, because I think it's a disservice to them in some areas that their whole history will be online and all the images of them will be online without them even having any say in that. And that's my personal view, but it may be that some parents share that view as well, and they might be quite upset if they're seeing their child's face online with their name attached to it without any permission at all. So just another thing to consider, and that's something you can put into your social media accounts as well, your policy as well. Volunteers are another one. I won't go too much on volunteers because it's harder to enforce a social media policy with volunteers, but Red Frogs, we were a volunteer organisation, and our volunteers, once we explained to them why we had certain policies, they were more than happy to abide by them, and we're really glad that we did it. So just consider what you can do for your volunteers as well, and where you might be able to say, hey guys, like if it's in a school capacity, we just prefer you didn't post about these things, and these are the reasons why. And you'll generally find that works well. And the final slide is for students. For the social media policy slide, your students are also a representative of the school, and they do have obligations. You can enforce obligations on them for the way that they use the school social media. They mention the school again. You don't necessarily want to stifle their use of social media, and it can be beneficial for your school if your students are excited about it on social media. But just explain to them the expectations for them. explain the reasons why it's important, explain that you're trying to protect them. I know it's hard explaining these things to students sometimes, but it's better than not doing anything. So I'm just shifting to the next slide again. The next slide after that is just a few practical tips for social media. So you should be on number 8. It says social media practical tips. One of the biggest tips is try and utilize private groups on Facebook and other platforms to control your audience as much as possible. So this doesn't necessarily eliminate the risk, but it reduces it, and you can be quite proactive with these things. So you can be telling parents, join our school social media page, come in and have the conversation there. And that's a really good way, first of all, to build a community. But it's also a great way to ensure that any posts about the school that the parents want to make happen in a private setting with other parents instead of on everyone's general news feed. Generally, you want to give the invitation to these groups freely so other people can invite each other, but that's something you'll have to explore. It may be worth having some kind of permission management, some kind of approval process before people are able to join. And you also want to elect moderators on your platforms who are across the law. So this is where having a social media manager really makes sense. These moderators can monitor all your school social media accounts. They can set up SEO, they can set up Google search alerts to check that nothing's being published about your school that you're not aware of, and just generally manage your digital presence. They can generally react quickly and take anything down that's questionable, and they'll probably be a lot more alive to whether something needs to be escalated or whether it can just be left alone, because they're probably dealing with these things a lot more. And yeah, I think that the bottom line for all that is just train your staff and your volunteers and your students to ask themselves, do I really need to post this? That's the big one. Just that 2-second thought before you hit the post button to make sure that they're considering what they're putting up before they put it up. Just moving to the next slide now. We always say this at the end of our presentations, but it bears repeating because it's a big issue. Litigation should only be used where absolutely necessary. I think many people are very keen to run off and litigate immediately, but litigation is a sword. It's very expensive and it's fraught with danger. It could be necessary in that situation like what I mentioned earlier, where there's some serious defamation there and it could affect someone's business, or if there are parents continually causing issues and the traditional routes haven't yielded any results, it may be that you need to litigate, but it should be embarked upon cautiously and with very good legal counsel. You always want to look out for possible exit points with anything, no matter where in the process you are. It's a lot better to settle things, shake hands, and move away than to keep pushing things forward in conflict. And look, sometimes, unfortunately, the only option for a school to get peace is to litigate. And that's obviously where we come in. But that's the end. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, please put them up in chat. I believe Joe wants to intro the next webinar.
Yeah, so we're going to give 20-30 seconds for any questions you have to come through. We've got a couple of minutes open for questions, so we'll do that. If you need to run off, no worries. Thank you so much for joining us. Just wanted to bring your attention to the next webinar, which is on Friday the 2nd of November at the same time, so that's 10 a.m. And it's about schools with chaplains. Are they employees or independent contractors? So you can follow the link and you can find the registration to that on our website. So feel free to sign up for that. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of offers that we've got open for our school friends. One is we're offering a tailored CPD presentation delivered by one of our senior school lawyers, which is a 2-hour seminar, interactive seminar at your school. Got Q&A, and you can learn more about specific issues. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, if there's something you'd like to find out more about, whether it's enrolment contracts, workplace health and safety, child protection, do get in touch with one of our business development team. We'd love to chat to you about that. We've also got an enrolment contract review service. It's a 4-step process, and it's for a fixed fee as well. So if as Matt was saying, that the enrolment contract is your first line of defense, so it's really worth sort of getting someone to review that if you're unsure about that. But yeah, we've seen a question come through.
Yeah, so Agnes M asks, she says, thank you for saying great presentation too, appreciate it. But she says, quick question, if there is a camera crew on a school campus, do they have a legal right to film and interview students and staff? Would there be something safe to say to ask them to film and interview students and staff? Would there be something safe to say to ask them to leave? Well, the first takeaway from that is that the school campus is private property. So you absolutely do have the right to refuse entry to anyone, except law enforcement or the ambulance or something similar. But if there is a film crew there, that's quite worrying. If you haven't given them permission to be there, I would definitely be asking them to leave. And look, if there's any issues with that, I'd honestly probably be saying, look, either you leave or we call the police, because you haven't been given permission to film here. And the privacy obligations for children are a lot more stringent than anyone else. So if the parents haven't given permission for their children to be filmed by that organisation, then they're going to be in a world of hurt anyway. But you should be really asking them to leave. And look, on that, I would just say it may be worth putting something in your enrolment contracts just to mention that the kids, the parents agree that the children may be, used in some their images may be used in some promotional material now and then. Obviously, that's something you'd want to consult with us or with another firm when you're doing your enrolment contract. But that helps you from a school perspective to manage anything like that. But yeah, you don't want film crews on your property unless you've given them permission to be there.
Fantastic, thanks, Matt. We can see a couple more questions being entered in. We're gonna give it another couple minutes. But yeah, just to remind you, a recording will be has been made. The recording on our website will actually show the slides along with Matt's presentation, so you'll be able to see the slides in line. You won't have to scroll along with it. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to give another half minute for any other questions to come through. And that looks like it's it. So thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, please do feel free to sign up.